Didn't realize that was a question. I thought it was just one thing. Well, I suppose you could just argue again from the naturalistic standpoint of both of them are part of the species Homo sapiens. Sapiens, both containing at least some similarities in chiral processes in the body, similarities in organs and whatnot. The things you'd say biologically that would be similar.
Sure.
The main difference being, well, I suppose, well, first we're assuming that John and Jim, I guess is a good assumption to make for your example, have at least varying differences in what one would say would be their mental processes, which one could say could come from the relative interactions of atoms within the brain in terms of neurosynapses and whatnot, which in turn depends on quantum mechanics to explain whether the electron densities have anything to do with that or not, quarks and all that other good stuff.
Follow-up question. Okay, say Jim dies.
Yeah.
Is Jim's body still a human?
How do you define human?
That's what I'm asking you.
Touche, good sir. I think it depends on the definition. I've heard different definitions of human. Some people say to be human is to have that ability to cognitively think, and from that standpoint, then Jim is not a human; he is a corpse. I guess I suppose if one defines humanity as biological.
You also get into ability to cognitively think. What about robots? Are robots humans too? All these other issues. I'm just kind of just bringing this up to show that it's a problem.
It depends on how you define human. There's really, I mean, at least to me, no way to objectively say human is human.
And the issue isn't humanity specifically. I'm just talking about the general idea of the problem of universals.
Yeah.
Like, how do you reconcile that? Because ultimately, you have all these universals, but then you have to figure out how these universals are related to the other universals. You have to come up with meta-universals to you kind of relate those to each other. And so you kind of almost get into an infinite regress, where there's just infinite all the way back, trying to figure out how these different universals in particular are related to each other. So that's another problem. Well, it's not so much a problem for those of us who believe in God, in that we have a God, specifically those of us who are Christians, we have a God that is simultaneously one and also many. God is triune, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, but they're still the same God. So this really isn't that much of an issue. I mean, we can discuss the particulars of the specific parts of universals and what quantifies each individual universal in particular, but ultimately the idea itself, the problem, doesn't really remain that much of a problem for us because that's part of our worldview. It's presupposed in the idea of God. So it's an issue for a lot of people, but not for us. For us, it's more of a game, trying to figure out how these different things relate to each other.
Doesn't necessarily say anything like hugely about the religion, though. I mean,
No.
I was going to say if you're going on the game of which religion has the most universals wins, then by all intents and purposes.
No, I mean, not which one wins, but which one can make sense of the idea of universals, particulars in general.
But then you have to actually even presuppose that universals exist in the first place, I suppose.
Right, but language is predicated upon universals.
Indeed.
And so
well, to a various extent, and then you get into the problem of language, which
which is basically the problem of universals directly applied.
Right. I suppose the difference would be you would say that it's solved. I would say that it's not. It's subjective.
But then you have to figure out how particulars are related to one another.
Indeed.
That's a problem. But this goes more so to demonstrate specifically why we should put the Christian God here as opposed to some other idea of a God. Because the whole point of these talks are, flying spaghetti monster versus God. And the flying spaghetti monster was originally envisioned to be sort of a satire of intelligent design. But I think people have been overextending the flying spaghetti monster as an explanation for various other philosophical concepts. And this is why. This is why I think it's overextended, because it doesn't answer a lot of these questions. The flying spaghetti monster doesn't meet all the necessary criteria for the intelligibility of reality. It doesn't answer the problem of universals. It doesn't make, there are various other problems. These are just two. I only touched on two because we have a limited amount of time. So, from that basis, I argue that no, the flying spaghetti monster doesn't answer all these questions and thus cannot be the grounding of the laws of logic or problem of universals or any other philosophical problem for that matter. Well, maybe a few, but not all of the ones that are necessary in order to establish a coherent worldview. So on that basis, I find the idea of the fighting spaghetti monster to be less than the idea of the Judeo-Christian God. Now, one point to note is some people will bring up ideas of dualism or polytheism. What about those gods accounting for laws of logic? Well, think of a dualistic god. So Ahura Mazda and I can't remember the evil god and Zoroastrianism. Anyone remember that?
Oh crap, can't think of him either, but I know what you're talking about.
Zoroastrianism it's kind of similar to Judaism. It came about in Persia a long time ago. I can't remember what time.
Earlier than most anyone had a concept of a great good or evil deity.
Right. So they had basically an all good deity that was in a constant eternal struggle with an all evil deity. It's called dualism. The problem with that is that the struggle is done between the gods using some sort of, I guess, spiritual physics. The way in which they wage war against one another, which is more powerful than either of them. They are both these two gods are fighting each other, and the way they fight each other is governed by a certain reality, a certain set of laws that they are both bound by. They can't exceed them. So that necessitates that there is another power that is exerting those laws upon them, which gets back to the original question of how to justify laws of logic. So because these gods are under these certain laws, the only way to explain those is to get back to the original problem. So dualism can't account for laws of logic. And the same criticism applies to polytheism, because the gods likewise are governed by certain laws and have limitations upon their abilities and whatnot. Another objection might be that, well, I guess we might get into that one then.
Do we need an objection?
Huh?
Do we need an objection, or
Sure.
do you have plenty?
I have this one. But
If you want to go through the TANG, then go right ahead. I'm just trying to formulate more.
Sure.
You mentioned that in order for the law, I agree with you in terms of the laws of logic being inherently circular in terms of proving the laws of logic. The laws of logic is the only way we can prove the laws of logic. You would argue that it would have to come from some being in order to make the universe make somewhat sense. Would that not be A, presupposing the being exists, and B, also presupposing that the being whose logic was handed down to you would also be the correct logic to explain it? And if he's not the fact that he's not a trickster god will be explained by the universal problem in terms of your Judeo-Christian view, but let's just assume that it's just, what if he's a little bastard?
Right. That's kind of entailed in this one.
Yeah, because what I would argue is that in all essentiality, the difference between perhaps your and I worldview and the laws of logic is I accept them as circular, and unless things prove otherwise, we have the laws of logic. We have that to explain the universe, but inherently the same presuppositions go into that as assuming that there's a deity. We're both operating under at least somewhat similar form of logic that does not necessarily have to entail a deity in so much as perhaps societal development.
Sort of.
To an extent, I said so.
Right. And I'll address those, but they're kind of entailed within this argument itself.
Fair enough.
This is an argument called the transcendental argument for the non-existence of God. It was proposed by an atheist philosopher by the name of Michael Martin. Wrote a book called Atheism, a Philosophical Justification, if you ever want to check that out. He's widely regarded as one of the heavy hitters, I guess, in atheist philosophy. I don't remember where he's a professor at, but pretty much anytime you use this line of reasoning, which is loosely known as the transcendental argument for the existence of God. It's not really an argument, it's not really a syllogism. People will usually bring up Michael Martin's response to it. And this remains pretty much the only real philosophical objection I've ever seen to it. I mean, I've looked around, I've gone to all the major atheist websites, infidels.org, Talk Origins, etc. It's pretty much all they've got. So hopefully you'll be able to come up with some more objections. But the syllogism is as follows. First premise is that logic presupposes that its principles are necessarily true. Well, I think I would agree with that. I think we kind of demonstrated that earlier. That kind of presupposes they're true in order to advance any kind of argument whatsoever. That's a problem, I think, but I figured, I think that there's a way to resolve it. That still remains for a problem for people who haven't come up with what this is. So that's kind of a problem, but we'll go on.